China's exports didn't slow. They fell off a cliff. No warning, no pattern, just silence. Inside the U.S. Treasury, the floor goes still. Phones stop ringing, screens freeze, every graph painted red, and no one can explain why. Across the Pacific, orders vanish from Nvidia's systems, like someone pulled the plug. Jensen Huang breaks the silence first.
We went from 95% of China's market to zero.
Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stands, signs the emergency order, and in that instant, the world's largest free market economy becomes something else entirely. Rare earths sound exotic, but they're not rare, they're everywhere. Inside turbines, electric vehicles, smartphones, and missiles. A decade ago, China produced 99% of the world's supply. Today, that share has slipped to around 68%. But the power never left Beijing, it simply moved upstream. Because refining, the process that turns ore into usable material, still happens almost entirely inside China. According to Bloomberg and the U.S. Geological Survey, between 90% and 95% of all global rare earth refining takes place on Chinese soil. Mining them elsewhere is easy. Processing them profitably is not. Western producers have learned that lesson the hard way. Take Australia's Lynas rare earths. They began building a U.S. refinery in Texas with Pentagon funding, but costs have tripled. Environmental compliance alone demands over 100 regulatory steps. And without long-term buyers, private financing dries up. That leaves Washington trapped in a dilemma. Impose tariffs on Chinese refined products and trigger a cost spiral, or keep importing them and remain strategically exposed. For months, officials debated quietly behind closed doors. Then came the September data, and a sharper realization. The U.S. can dig its own ore, but it still has to send it to China for processing. If relations deteriorate further, that door could slam shut overnight. A senior Commerce Department official admitted to Reuters,
"Processing bottlenecks are our single largest vulnerability."
This isn't protectionism, it's dependency, with a patriotic label. At the center of it all stands President Trump, insisting tariffs make America stronger. "We're in a powerful position because of tariffs," he told reporters, echoing his defense from the first trade war. But the numbers tell another story. The Peterson Institute estimates tariffs have raised U.S. import costs by 12% since 2023, and the trade deficit still ballooned past $1.2 trillion last year. The economics bend further under scrutiny. According to the Department of Energy's June 2025 report, every ton of rare earth oxide produced in the U.S. costs 3 times more than China's average. Even if Washington launches 22 new rare earth projects by 2030, as forecast by the International Energy Agency, Beijing can counter at will. Restrict exports today, flood the market tomorrow. Collapse prices below Western production costs. The same leverage OPEC once held now sits in Beijing's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology. That's not speculation, that's arithmetic. By October, the situation deepens. China's Ministry of Commerce announces new export licensing rules, targeting magnet-grade oxides like neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium, the elements that power electric motors and missile guidance systems. It's a mirror move, retaliation for the semiconductor bans Washington placed on China a year earlier. In Beijing's logic, symmetry means fairness. In Washington's, it means coercion. The fallout spreads fast. U.S. chipmakers, already bleeding from counterbans, now face a double choke.
Nvidia's Jensen Huang told investors, "We went from 95% market share in China to zero." I can't imagine any policymaker thinking that's a good idea.
Nvidia has written China out of its forecast completely. The world's second-largest computer market gone overnight. Inside China, that vacuum becomes acceleration. Huawei Technologies, once crippled by U.S. sanctions, is ramping up its Ascent 910 AI chips. Financial Times reports output is doubling from 300,000 units this year to 600,000 next. This isn't symbolism, it's substitution, in real time. Every chip Huawei sells replaces one the US can no longer supply. Each replacement shifts global innovation eastward, and here the two stories converge: semiconductors and rare earths. Chip fabrication relies on rare earth magnets for lithography, cooling, wafer handling. TSMC, the world's most advanced chip maker, still depends on Chinese processed materials for its equipment supply chain. A slowdown in shipments from Beijing could ripple through US foundries within weeks. One TSMC executive told Nikkei Asia,
"We can diversify labor and capital, not chemistry."
That's the quiet truth few in Washington admit. So what happens when both sides pull the trigger? If China controls the midstream inputs and the US controls the tariff gun, what happens when both fire at once? The logic collapses on itself. Tariffs raise costs. Costs cripple production. And production shortfalls empower the very supplier being punished. Economic deterrence becomes dependence under a new name. The White House insists it can break the cycle through industrial policy. Enter Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent. In a televised briefing on October 11, 2025, Bessent unveiled a strategic market stabilization framework. Behind that phrase hides a historic shift. The US government will now set price floors for critical minerals, guaranteeing profitability for strategic industries. If market demand falls below that price, the Treasury steps in, as buyer of last resort. Bessent calls it defense, critics call it control. Former Fed Governor Randall Kroszner told the Wall Street Journal,
"Price controls in an inflationary environment risk magnifying imbalances rather than solving them."
because when the government guarantees high prices, producers overproduce, consumers pull back, and taxpayers foot the bill. Still, the administration presses forward. Internal estimates reviewed by Reuters suggest Washington could allocate up to $40 billion in forward purchase agreements to stockpile strategic minerals, a metals version of the 1970s petroleum reserve. Supporters call it pragmatic realism. Opponents call it panic, disguised as policy. Either way, the math doesn't lie. Price floors mean inflated costs. Inflated costs mean heavier inflation. And inflation, once embedded, doesn't leave quietly. Producer price index data already shows industrial input costs 6% higher year on year. Locking in those prices guarantees that inflation becomes structural. The irony? A policy meant to stabilize prices could institutionalize volatility across the Pacific. Beijing watches almost amused. State media calls it proof that free markets exist only in textbooks. But China has done the same for years. The difference is narrative. When Beijing intervenes, it calls it coordination. When Washington does, it calls it defense. Inside corporate America, frustration builds. Executives warn that government interference distorts the very market signals private investors rely on.
We don't need artificial prices, we need predictable demand.
But markets move faster than debate. Mining ETFs surged 15% the week after Bessent's announcement. Speculation loves stability more than ideology. Still, time remains the one thing Washington cannot buy. Building a domestic rare earth supply chain from mine to magnet will take a decade and over $100 billion. Even with subsidies, capital isn't the constraint. Experience is. And that experience lives inside Chinese refineries. From Inner Mongolia to Jiangxi, both sides double down. China restricts exports to defend sovereignty. The US restricts imports to defend industry. The result? Mutual inflation. Consumers pay twice, first through tariffs, then through taxes that fund compensation schemes. Logic bends under ideology's weight. Bessent, to his credit, recognizes the danger.
In a CNBC interview on October 15th, he said, "We're not abandoning markets, we're reinforcing them against manipulation."
Conviction or justification? That's for history to decide. But the admission is striking. For decades, Washington condemned price controls as a hallmark of failing states. Now it embraces them, in the name of resilience. Meanwhile, Nvidia's fate crystallizes the larger dilemma. US innovation still depends on global demand, and global demand now flows through ecosystems the US is walling off. Bloomberg Intelligence reports Chinese AI startups bought $7 billion worth of domestic chips in 2025, up from less than $1 billion 3 years ago. Each lost sale for Nvidia becomes an R&D grant for Huawei. Market exclusion isn't isolation, it's redirection. And that loop brings us back to the beginning. The refinery gate in Bao 2. The export form stamped restricted. The policy memo on Bessent's desk. Each decision solving one crisis while quietly creating another. Tariffs defend independence, but destroy margins. Export bans protect sovereignty, but fracture supply chains. Price floors preserve industries, but distort prices. Every cure begins to look like the disease. So what's left is the question neither side wants to face. If both Washington and Beijing believe they're defending the market from manipulation, who's left defending the market itself? Thanks for watching Geoscope. If you found this story insightful, like, subscribe, and watch the next episode now on your screen.